Hello, thanks everybody for joining us. Today we have an exciting community call about work that's been done on the tokenomics for Mina. So we had an RFC from the community asking to have another look at things like the monetary expansion rate and how rewards are distributed amongst people delegating and producing blocks. And economics design have now delivered their first milestone, which is looking at the existing model and looking at ways to modify it. And we're now looking for a round of community feedback. So Femi here from Economics Design will present their findings from round one. After this call, there will be a forum post on Mina Research where you can leave your feedback in the usual format of like replying to the thread and having an in-depth discussion. And we'll also take questions at the end of this call. So, Femi, the stage is
All right.
yours.
Thanks, Philip, for the intro. So, hi, everybody. This is Femi from Economics Design, and we've been working for a few weeks with the Mina Foundation on a few changes that will be presented today. The approach was mainly looking at how can we technically change some of the parameters without really altering the core promise of Mina. So that's what we try to do here. And we're coming up with a few proposals and a few changes that will be discussed with the community, obviously. We prepared a few slides, so without further ado, I will start with the first content overview. So we will be talking about an introduction of a token locking mechanism for the Mina stake tokens. Then that is also tied to the potential creation of a decentralized treasury. So these two proposals are kind of tied together. If we have some time, we'll also introduce the dynamic fee structure, but this will be discussed later. So the few discussions that we will have in the next few days and weeks will mainly focus on the first 2 points. Then we will see next steps and conclude with potentially questions from the community. So the first few steps that we took technically are how can we look at creating a treasury, a completely decentralized treasury? How can we make sure that the treasury gets some funds allocated to it without, again, minting new tokens, without having to increase the inflation of the whole protocol? So we had to play with the current parameters. We looked at multiple things, and one of the designs of Mina is that the staking today doesn't require the lock-in of the tokens. It is very interesting because it's more of a positive approach, but the issue with that is there's no real requirement for someone to stake. So anybody that would like to participate just says, yes, I am staking my tokens against this specific node, for example, but there's no requirement for those tokens to stay locked for a certain period of time. So anybody can just stake, then move their tokens and do whatever they want with them. It's still working. There's no issues with it today. But if we think about the sustainability of the ecosystem, it makes sense that we look into different approaches. One other reason that pushes us to explore locking stake tokens is if we want to work towards having a protocol that has almost instant finality. Those mechanisms require some locking of the tokens, and that's why we're working towards that approach. If we look at how we looked at this or how we approached it, so we're trying to introduce a token locking, as I just mentioned, to establish a decentralized treasury and enhance the economy and long-term sustainability. If we implement this token locking, we aim to control the inflation as well, and we will see in what sense and how did that mean. And at the same time, we would like to, as I mentioned, transition to a potential consensus mechanism that enables instant finality. In tandem with the lock-in, obviously, we will create a decentralized treasury and then replenish it through the redistribution of the excess native emissions. And we'll also dive deeper into this, which would provide a robust financial foundation to support the growth of the ecosystem. The key goal is to provide more predictability for the stakers and That means having expected reward ratios, for example, as well as strengthening the economy and driving sustainability through these new initiatives. So the first one is the lock-in of the tokens. Current model today is you can stake Mina tokens freely, which maintains full liquidity, and you can move those tokens, do whatever you want right after you stake them, up until we go to the next epoch where you have to kind of stake them again. So it's very flexible. It's cool for now, but the flexibility is encouraging more users to stake because they don't have to lock their tokens. So there's no real commitment if I stake. It's almost like a vote of confidence. The variable revenue distribution comes from the fact that people are technically moving their stake and moving their tokens around. So there's no real expectation of a fixed kind of revenue expectation month over month, for example. And if we introduce the token locking, the idea here is we expect that if we introduce a mandatory token lock for people who are staking the tokens, that will potentially lower the staking ratio. So we know that everybody today is staking easily because you don't have to lock your tokens. You just need to kind of prove your staking or say, I am staking my tokens against this node. But in the future, if we force locking of the stake tokens, some people will decide to do otherwise because they might need their liquidity to do other things. So forcing locking will potentially decrease the overall staking participation. And this is kind of the biggest assumption we're making. We're pretty confident that this will happen to a certain extent. If we reduce the staking ratio, so this means that there's less people staking, there's less tokens being staked in the protocol, which also means that the overall rewards that we're distributing, we are distributing them to less people. That also obviously means that the fewer participants will be potentially earning higher rewards because of that mechanism. If we decide to kind of control that reward ratio, then we will have that predictability in the revenue, which means that we can say that, let's say today we have a 60-something% participation in the staking. If we reduce that by 10, 20, 30%, that's more revenue in the pockets of the people who stayed, who actually locked their tokens. And that is also a little bit more predictable because we can actually decide to target a specific APY range. On the graph on the right side here, you can see that I'm displaying a potential APY range around the 10%. And we can sustain that 10% APY range for tokens staked in the Mina protocol up to 950 million tokens staked. We can still guarantee that 10% APY range, and down to like 300 million tokens staked. So as long as we stay within that range, we can guarantee that something close to 10%, not exactly 10%, it's going to be having small fluctuations. And at the same time, we can even actually save some of the tokens that are emitted by each block. Actually, the 720 current tokens that we're giving each block, we can save some of those for a potential treasury. The other thing that we discussed is if the tokens are locked, they are taken out of circulation, which increases the token rarity and technically should help increase the price of the token. So this is also a mechanism that could help the whole economy go up, because if we're having less tokens in circulation, we know that there will be usually more demand for the fewer tokens that are still there, and that usually brings the price upwards, not aggressively, but still it has an impact. And the final point that we discussed is if we implement locking of the tokens that we stake, we would potentially introduce staking tiers. The tiers would be based on the amount that is being staked and obviously the duration of the tokens that are being locked. So combining the amount and the duration would potentially define the tier that you would fit in. And then different tiers will have different reward levels, obviously, because the more committed to the protocol, the more rewards you should earn. So that's part one of what we discussed and what we've been kind of analyzing and researching. And this is kind of how can we stabilize the expectation of APY, or at least the APY range, and keep it around something like 10%. And we did the exercise for 10, 12, and 14%, by the way. And if we do so, how many tokens do we expect potentially to be locked, really? And how much revenue can we save for a potential treasury? And we will see all of this in the next few slides. So this is the staking proposal. And as I mentioned, it goes hand in hand with the treasury replenishment. The idea here is today, the current inflation rate overall is at 9%, which corresponds to 720 Mina tokens emitted for each block. This 9% is theoretical because it is also based on the concept of everybody's staking technically. So if we reduce the staking ratio, then there will be a higher APY for people, not inflation rate, higher APY, because obviously there are fewer people that are sharing the same pieces of a bigger cake in the end. If we stay at the current inflation rate, the 9% or the 720 Mina tokens per block, which is more accurate, I think we can easily target a 10% APY for the validators while maintaining the same inflation rate, maintaining the same APY, but doing recalculations every epoch to really identify, are we meeting those objectives or not? Should we readjust ratios, or should we actually up the rewards to the node operators, or maybe reduce them because we have enough, and transfer the exceeding tokens to a potential treasury? The idea is obviously based on a few assumptions. The biggest assumption is how much of the currently staked tokens will kind of be unstaked. Concept is a little bit weird to understand because I'm explaining it backwards. So if we say that today we have 100 tokens that are staked, and if we force the locking of the tokens, we would go down to a 70 tokens staked. That would mean a drop in staking of 30% or 30 tokens. So that's the math behind it. If we look at what it means in numbers, we see that if we target a 14% APY, which is a little bit aggressive, and expect a 30% drop in the participation for stakers, so means 30% of the stakers would decide to do other things with their tokens, then what we can have is we can guarantee a 14% APY for the 70% remaining stakers, which also means that we can allocate 17% of those 720 Mina tokens per block to replenishing the treasury. Over a full year, that means approximately $10 million that would be funneled to the treasury, and that corresponds to a little bit less than $800,000 per month. The objectives of the Mina Foundation is to sustain something in the $2 million per month to help the current protocol builders really focus on the ecosystem growth and develop the next ZK apps and help really take the Mina Protocol to the next level. Because we know that we need to build many things, and we need to rely on these builders actually to make sure that we're building the strongest protocol possible with the lightest impact possible, because we know that Mina is the lightest blockchain. So that being said, I have highlighted in green what scenarios would take us to approximately $2 million in revenue per month, which is our current objective. It doesn't mean that if we don't reach $2 million, everything is going to collapse, but this is kind of a business objective that we gave ourselves just to make sure that we have enough budget to really support the protocol growth. So I did this exercise for if we had to sustain a 14% APY. We also did it obviously for a 12% APY, and then we can see that we can reach something around the 2 million with a high drop or a moderate drop of 50%, for example. But if we target only 10% APY, we see that almost in all cases, we reach something close to $2 million. So with only 30% drop, we are at $1.8 million. While with a 50% drop that we saw, which we call moderate, we're already above the $2 million objective that we have. As I mentioned, the goal is not necessarily to just provision the treasury with tokens. The goal is to make sure that we're maintaining a certain APY ratio for all the stakers, and at the same time, we are replenishing a treasury that it will be used to really support the ecosystem growth moving forward, and that's really needed without having to mint new tokens. That's the biggest requirement that we have here. So that's what we looked at. We see that potentially the 10% APY would be the easiest solution to implement because it takes us to our objectives faster, as well as obviously 10% is still a pretty decent APY if we compare with other protocols and other L1 chains more specifically. So that's the first step, which is how can we actually change the distribution of those 720 Mina tokens per block to make sure that we are maintaining a minimum level of return for people who are staking. In this case, we're talking about 10%, while at the same time making sure that we're also building and replenishing a treasury that will have a big impact in sustaining the ecosystem growth. Some key considerations. So everything is not set in stone yet. What we wanted to do is to have this done in an approach, in a phased approach. Concept is today we would introduce the idea and the overall strategy. Then we would have a few days to discuss these and dive a little bit more into the details and get approval from the community, obviously. Once that is done, then we would go back into the exercise of diving into the details and defining the final parameters. Like, for example, are we talking about exactly 10%? Is it 10.5, 11%? We need to know exactly what is that percentage. Same as the intervals. How often are we redoing the math to make sure that we're redistributing properly the tokens between the treasury and the stakers? For now, we're thinking every epoch, which makes sense because that's how we're already operating. So without having to disrupt the whole protocol, I think this makes sense. The other thing is, should we set up a maximum emissions cap for the treasury? So the idea here is how much of the tokens should go to the treasury? Should that be capped or not? And really defining the details of what goes to the staking rewards and what goes to the treasury. And finally, defining the different lock-in durations and the corresponding rewards to see if we can build different staking tiers and make sure that people are actually rewarded properly for staking more tokens for longer periods of time, obviously. So those are the key considerations for these two proposals that go hand in hand. To remind everybody, or maybe to refresh for those who joined a little bit late, we're talking about implementing a token locking system for the stake tokens, which should reduce the number of stake tokens, which also should allow us to reduce the number of rewards we're distributing to the stakers and save some of the inflation tokens to replenish a potential treasury. So that's what we had to present, at least for these two proposals. I know that there's a few questions from the community in the live chat, so I think it's potentially about time we address some of those questions.
Yeah, let's do that. Thanks so far for the presentation. The first question that I see is, isn't 10% the current ROI more or less? More or less, yeah, go ahead.
The current ROI is around 10%. It varies depending on the node. It varies from epoch to another, but we came up with the 10% to kind of stay very close to the current status. Yeah. And by the way, this kind of reminds me of another question that we asked ourselves. All these assumptions are based on the current price of the Mina token, which means that if our assumption of the price should go up becomes real, then we will obviously have much better scenarios, because then we can reach that $2 million faster, and we won't potentially have to like take a big cut to the treasury. We will have kind of, once we dive into the details, we will have scenarios for positive macro situations versus like a bear market conditions, so we can have different parameters for different conditions, obviously.
Thanks. The next question is whether this change will require a hard fork, and that's true, right? It's a protocol
Yeah,
level
I
change, so
think,
it requires a
yeah,
hard.
this touches the consensus, and actually tokens are distributed at each block. So yes, this will require potential hard fork.
Yeah. Next question is what kind of lockup durations are you targeting?
We don't have the answer to that yet. The minimum is obviously the duration of an epoch, but I think it might be a little bit too short. So maybe 2 epochs might, like, it's sounding like something good, but we will come back with the details around the durations and the percentages in the next phase, because we did not dive there yet. We wanted to get some approval on the high level on the idea first.
Right. Next question is how to attract holders to actually lock their tokens.
It's a very good question. Well, most people today are used to the idea of like staking and locking their tokens to stake. So this is not a completely new concept that we're bringing to the table. Like if you think about Ethereum, everybody's locking their tokens when they stake it. So there's the potential of having a liquid staking token that could come. I did not talk about it at all because we did not dive enough into that concept. So I might be like saying things that I'm not supposed to say right now, but that could keep some confidence in the fact that you don't have to just lock your tokens and keep waiting. But the concept here is, if you believe in the future of the Mina protocol, if you like the protocol, and if you want to support it, then you can support it through staking. And at the same time, you will obviously earn a 10% APY, which is not neglectable. So that's what we're betting on. We know that it's easier today to convince people to stake because there's no requirement to just say, yes, I'm staking, but that is not necessarily sustainable in the long term.
Next question is actually really good and really important. Is this actually going to be implemented? And the answer is, of course, that depends on the community. So what we are presenting here is a recommendation, and Femi and his colleagues will post a post on Mina Research afterwards. And then the idea is that after we get community feedback, this is turned into an MIP, and then the Mina holders will have a vote on this. So
yep. So yeah, so this will pass if the community agrees, obviously, as it should go.
Yeah. Right. There's also a question about setting up a maximum supply of Mina. And
I'm not sure I fully understand that, because I believe that's already it's L1 chains. Does this mean that we would go back to kind of a fixed supply or maximum supply in terms of like inflated tokens? I'm not sure I fully understand this actually.
I think it's about like at the moment we have like these 720 Mina per block as a reward, and then there's kind of like an implicit expectation that at some point the system will just be sustainable through fees without additional minted tokens, like the long-term perspective for Bitcoin. And so I think that is a suggestion to just like make a commitment now for how long we will keep minting new tokens, and whether there's a hard cap. And at the moment there isn't a hard cap.
Yeah, that's a big decision to take, obviously, but I think for now we're looking at potentially putting a cap on how do we use the 720 tokens within each block. Maybe later we can look at having a hard cap overall for the whole economy or the whole protocol, but I don't think it's necessary for now.
Yeah, and as another commenter said, it's really hard to do that before you have sufficient influx of fees, because you do need to incentivize the people running the nodes and running the
Yeah,
snark.
yeah, yeah. And we need to actually we're in a like we need to grow, and we need to grow a lot. So that will require obviously rewarding multiple economic agents like the snarkers, the validators, and more. Obviously.
Right. The only thing I see is a comment, like a reply to what we just said. Yes, it's a proposal at the moment, but the community will have the final say on this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay,
I don't
we'll
see
wait
any
for more
questions.
questions.
Oh,
I know
say.
that there's one more slide I did not present, which is talking about the dynamic fees, because this is going to be discussed at a later phase. So this will be discussed if we finish the details about the first proposals and they get approved and we start the implementation. So next phase would be obviously to look at introducing a dynamic fee structure. The concept again is already used by other protocols, and the idea here is to have a dynamic fee that adjusts to the protocol congestion. So if the protocol has a lot of transactions, then we can have the dynamic fee go higher. And if the protocol goes back to healthier KPIs, then we can reduce the dynamic fee. So the idea is we would have a kind of a Coinbase fee plus a dynamic fee, which means that the base fee would be like defined by the protocol, um, which includes the Coinbase and dynamic. And then there will be the priority fee that everybody's familiar with today, that would potentially be decided by the end user. So as an end user, if I do a transaction, I would see that there's a fee that I have to pay, but I can also pay a little bit more to prioritize my transaction if I wanted to. So that will be the new approach. And that dynamic fee that I would see originally will be decided by the protocol. There will be like a base and a dynamic portion to it. The concept there is to make sure that if the protocol is super busy, we can actually implement a fee and then generate a little bit more revenue, and also slow down a lot of potential like bot activity and that kind of noise. And if the protocol is doing well, then we let it go. So that additional fee that we might charge, and again, everything is in theory here, we would also funnel to the Treasury to actually have those tokens being used for the ecosystem growth in general and sustainability. But again, this is a phase 2 proposal. So I'm going to go back to the initial ones, or actually go to the next steps, which are, as I mentioned, the community discussion, finalizing the parameters around the token locking mechanisms, token durations, the excess emission thresholds, the split ratio, and all those parameters. And once that is approved, then we get into the implementation. That will take us some time as well. I see that there's more questions here.
Right. First question, do you have any consideration on whether it is a good idea to eliminate zero-fee snarks?
We had long discussions on the zero fee snarks, and I don't think it would be possible to eliminate the zero fee snarks. We also thought about maybe having a minimal snark fee, but it doesn't really, and we did some simulations and we saw that it doesn't really change much if we implement like or force minimal snark fees. We will definitely go back to that conversation and see how we can make sure that we can implement something that is good for now and especially good for our future expansion goals. So here, if everything, if a lot of the snarks are for free, it's not good for the protocol and even for the snarkers, especially if we want to grow and get to like a composability play and have more volume being processed on the Mina protocol. What about snarks versus fees to handle network congestion? I'm not sure I'm understanding. Snarks versus fees. to handle network congestion. Do you understand the question, Philip?
There's a clarification: snarks fees versus transaction fees.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I think it's about like.
I think, yeah. In the future, once we start diving into that dynamic fee structure, we will obviously include transaction fees and snark fees. All the fees will be considered to see what makes sense. What makes sense from all perspectives, by the way, from an end user perspective, to make the protocol as cheap as possible, because we don't want to have the protocol super expensive, as well as from a snarker, as well as from the protocol perspective, and make sure that everything is going to be sustainable as well. Yeah, someone says that in the past, high network activity required additional snark workers to handle the load. It's true, it happened, and it will potentially happen again. So if you introduce a higher fee there, we will reward those people for their hard work as well. So we'll discuss it, as I said, in a future phase. Someone is asking about buying back the Mina tokens. I think that is something to be considered, but buying back the Mina tokens obviously has a cost. To buy back Mina, you need to have US dollars, and if we need to buy millions and millions of dollars of Mina tokens, we would need to have those dollars, and it's not sustainable. That's what I'm trying to say. We're trying to build a solution that could survive on its own, a mechanism that could be sustainable for multiple years. Buybacks are usually a short-term solution, unless we use some of the fees to do the buyback, which is going to be discussed in the next phase, which is like the how do we introduce dynamic fees. So that's the idea of having dynamic fees, because if we have a sustainable way of getting back those tokens, then we can do it properly. But if we're only buying back using dollars, that's a short-term fix. It's not gonna be sustainable. Yeah, snark fees versus transaction fees. We got it. Can't the burn-in mechanism be designed? So for now, we don't have the details of the burning mechanism, but we are definitely looking at it. We are not necessarily gonna implement it as a phase one. As I mentioned, I think the biggest potential here is for the lock-in of the tokens. Phase two would be looking at the dynamic fee structure with the potential introduction of burning. We might not even have to burn, by the way, because technically moving the tokens to the Treasury means that we're not going to dump them right away, and we're going to try to use them the best way possible. But yeah. Another person is asking about the burn. Everybody likes the burning idea, by the way, but although we do like it too, we think we need to be careful with it. As I mentioned, the best way of implementing burn is if we're capturing dynamic fee structures, and if on every transaction we're capturing a small portion, then that could become a better mechanism for burning, or even for buying back, or to replace the buying back mechanism, actually. A good question about how long does the forum discussion last? We were thinking a few days, but maybe you have a better idea, Philip, here.
Yeah, I would think initially a week, and then we will see like how lively the discussion is. Like usually with these Mina research from posts, there's not a strict deadline until which a conclusion needs to be set. In this case, it's a little bit different because we already have like a fleshed out proposal, and we're asking for feedback rather than like a typical like ideation kind of thing. But I think we would look at it after a week and look at how is the discussion going. Are there still meaningful contributions coming in, and then we move on.
Yeah,
it's always a balance between like getting like you want to get a lot of feedback and meaningful feedback, but you also want to move on at some point. So I think having a week initially, and then we see whether the discussion is still like very productive, or whether it has whether it's already able to draw conclusions.
There's a good comment at the end. Someone is saying my thoughts on this locking and or burning won't matter once there's a massive volume of projects utilizing Mina, but in the beginning it will help. When we were looking at all the economic parameters, we also got to that same conclusion. The best thing that could happen is having hundreds and thousands of projects deployed on Mina. That will bring everything up, and that will help all the KPIs, obviously. But that doesn't happen overnight. That takes time, and that's why we're implementing these mechanisms, so we can actually have a budget to support that. The goal of building the treasury is to really incentivize the ecosystem growth and get to having multiple projects on board, which will grow the activity rates and then usually reduces the need for us to have these mechanisms, obviously. Someone is saying this could be great if we can increase the burn rate above inflation. We can also ensure SNARK apps burn a certain amount. Yeah. So this is again, this has been discussed, and I think we'll keep note of these comments. If you can also put them on the forum, because we will take those into consideration when we will dive into phase 2, which means defining the details and the parameters of this approach. Yeah, and Shaylis is saying that locking might be the best for now because burning is a little bit complicated to implement. And even from the legal point of view, burning is complicated to implement, obviously. So we think that this locking mechanism not only helps on the economic side, but as I mentioned earlier, if we're trying to work towards instant finality, we might need some locking and some slashing mechanisms. So we're slowly moving towards that reality. But locking for now is being implemented for economic reasons.
Yeah, just as a comment, I think that with the burning, it's not really the implementation complexity. It's more like the where do the tokens that you want to burn come from, and the legal things. It's like
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So first forum discussion, then MIP, and last implement. Yeah, that's the idea.
That's the order. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, should we wait a few minutes for further questions?
Yeah, don't hesitate. If you have any question, we're here. And by the way, I think this is also recorded for those who would like to listen to it later.
Mm-hmm.
And we will have the forum, the recording, and Discord, obviously, for interactions. As Philip mentioned, we are aiming for a week. If we have enough traction, then we would potentially submit the MIP next week. If we need a little bit more time, we will let the community obviously know.
All right, I don't see any further questions. Thanks a lot for the presentation, Femi. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your attention. And as we said, there'll be a forum post on Mina Research. So if you have opinions or additional insights or anything you want to contribute, that's the place to go. And then, yeah, we'll take that feedback into consideration and we'll come back to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And we're looking forward to this.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.